a word that James uses a lot. And that word is bonjour. Fill that in. As many of you know, this is a versatile word in James's vocabulary. It doesn't just mean hello. He can use it as a greeting, certainly, but also as a reply, as an emphasis, or as a sort of mysterious comment. Sort of a bonjour. And James puts himself into it every time he says it, but you're never quite sure what he's getting at. You know that you're possibly in quite a lot of trouble, but you're not quite sure what he's getting at. And I feel like I should know. James and I were born within a couple of days of each other. We met at secondary school in Cambridge, and I remember very well my first sighting of him on the first day of our new term. When he joined our school, he was what can only be described as a geeky platinum blonde fuzzball with a brief mix. There was, however, unmistakably a twinkle in his eye, and his transition into hackage, hormonal terror of the per-school sixth forms, was a metamorphosis to behold. Since then, we've thrown our 18th, 25th, and 33rd birthday parties together. We've worked at the same firm, we've gone on the odd holiday together, we've become very good friends. So I should be well qualified to speak today and interpret James and the many undercurrents of his bonjour. But it's not easy to put the phenomenon that is James into words. He's a man of many consistencies and many contradictions, but very briefly I'm going to try. If I had to use words, and French words at that, to describe James, I'd need two rather than one, and they are bon viveur. For James is a good liver. He's turned it into a bit of an art form for himself. He's a good teacher of it too. But as you can possibly sense that I'm going to go on and say, being a good liver is something that doesn't always mean that you're good to your liver. James likes a drink. And he doesn't always drink like a mere mortal. In his own words, what he's fully capable of is roaring smoke. There is no one story that I can tell you on this theme because there's no way I could limit it to one. James and alcohol is an anecdotal embarrassment. I have, however, spotted a common narrative in the alcohol-fueled nights of my life with James, and in the stories some of you have told me. So rather than share a specific story with you, I thought I'd share a narrative template for an evening with James on form. It does follow a formula, and I think I've worked it out. You can then apply your own stories to this formula, talk amongst yourself. So here it is, a template for a great night with James. You have met for a quiet evening, perhaps in a bar. James arrives. Any other man in the circumstances would not have made it. He has just returned from far-off travels, for example, or more likely massive overindulgence of some sort, which makes it preposterous that he is even in your company. By right, he should not be there.
This is true.
But James has made the effort. This and his general presence rejuvenates all concern. He then suggests something innocently he refers to as a schnitzel. This is when things take a turn. After a few drinks, the pace of the event starts inexorably to accelerate. James then somehow invents a new cocktail.
It's all true.
Notable creations of his in the past include the Terry Butcher, which is so named because it features Cointreau, which tastes a bit like Terry Orange, and Bailey's, which I'm assured butchers you. He will then attempt to persuade you, the barman, and anyone that will listen that this vile concoction is a recognised brand. Do not attempt to lead at this point, however, or you will be offered a variation on the Schnifter, which is one for the road. Predictably, everyone involved, including James, will take things too far. Some somebody, it might be you, it might be James himself, may end up in pain, possibly even in hospital. Either through alcohol or equally likely a dancing injury, which could be self or third party inflicted. The next day dawns, James will have left in his wake a devastation of entertained but exhausted people. Maybe you speak to him the next day thinking that you'll discuss recovery strategies. Your conversation will be brief, however, because James really must excuse himself. Unfortunately, he has a commitment with some others for lunch in a pub down the road, and he's considering a shift. A memorable evening with James does not have to involve alcohol. It can involve spontaneity. I remember him deciding one evening when we were teenagers and with a group of friends that he wanted to see the sea. Immediately. In fact, it was midnight and we were in Cambridge. There was no impediment to this. So we went with his whim, and one absurdly long and late car drive later, we had a fantastic night in a group at the beach. It did deteriorate a little bit when we realised it was cold and all we had to sleep under was one newspaper. James decided, James decided that he'd not been allocated his fair share of said newspaper amongst his friends and stormed off the beach instead. Not all stole me. Still bitter, Peter. Not otherwise moved the storming off, as it turned out, as his chosen sleeping point was below the high tide mark. So it didn't work out for him. A good night with James can also involve his flamboyance. If an event needs a lift, he can provide it. And I remember well an evening on a skiing holiday in Austria, which James had clearly decided was proceeding too tamely. He quietly disappeared, only to re-emerge into the centre of the room, intent on transforming it into a party spectacle. He arrived wrapped tightly in cooking foil. From which he burst forth to reveal a very fetching bra and skirt. And announced that he wanted to introduce us to his alter ego for the evening, Doris Gay. Few of us have returned to look an Austrian in the eye ever since. So, James enabled us all to have a very good time that night, but to be serious just for a moment, James is one of those people who does encourage and enable people in other ways. You see it in how he promotes and supports the creative work of his brother and sister and of his wider family, who I know mean the world to him. You see it in the loyalty he generates with those who have worked for and with him. And he generates it because of his contradictions. He's imaginative and unconventional, but those of us who work with him know he's professional. He can be utterly charming, but he's authentic. He knows when to be serious, but he doesn't take himself too seriously. And as a result, people speak a bit freer, they do what they enjoy, they embrace work and life a bit more when they're around James, and that's quite a gift. But we're here to celebrate that James has met the right man, as indeed he has. I think the day I knew Riaz was special to James came when they were both very, very, very late to a reception in London at which James had some responsibilities. I'd actually been sent into the streets to try and find them. Eventually they did arrive, and it was pretty clear from the expression on James's face and the enormo Starbucks in Riaz's hand that suffering a long queue to satiate Riaz's caffeine fix was responsible for the delay. James knew he was in the wrong. He shot me this wordless but very expressive look, which clearly translated as, "Yes, I know this is wrong, but I love him, what can I do?" Riaz, of course, didn't feel any need to justify himself. And when I shot him a quizzical look, he just looked right back at me and just went, special edition Starbucks eggnog latte. I'm sure we can all list a lot of ways in which James and Riaz seem to be opposites, but in all the important ways, as everyone has already highlighted this evening, they're complementary. You could see it in that ceremony to today. We'll see it on the dance floor tonight, I'm sure. The bottom line is that they're both great, great fun, and it's an important commodity in this world, and they nurture it in us all. And I'd like to conclude with a final thought on James. When I think of James in his 20s, I think of him dancing to a song, which is one of the songs on our card, in fact, a song by Mojo, which a lot of people associate with James, the main lyric of which is about happiness and about telling a lot by the look in your eye. And the fact is that James has always had the same schoolboy twinkle in his eye. Life has thrown some challenges at him in the past, and it's sure to throw some at him and Riaz in the future, but we all know that that twinkle will always be there. James has brought a lot of fun into our lives in the past, but today we're celebrating the fact that he and Riaz have sealed their own happiness. I know that's what they've done, and I couldn't be happier for both of them. So, ladies and gents, I'd ask you to raise your glasses for a final toast to James, to Riaz, to fun.